All right, very good. Okay, so up next, we have a panel, obviously. And so data is an incredibly potent tool for enabling better decision-making, but what stories are hidden in that data? And to talk to us about that, we have, from Microsoft, the head of emerging experiences, Ben Rudolph. All right. Up next, we have, from Recode, Rani Molla. Next, from the Associated Press, we have Troy Thibodeaux. And last but very, very much not least, we have from Microsoft again, we have Lukasz Pawlowski.
You did it. All right, welcome. Thank you for hanging out. Sorry about the audio issues. So we'll jump right in. So some of you probably saw yesterday our friends from the AP talking about the interesting state that media as a whole is in right now. That you could argue that the media has never been more important. A free, an honest, deeply data-driven media is more important than ever, but there are also exterior forces that are, oh, that's from out there. I thought that was a question that was getting yelled at already. But there are exterior forces that are starting to press on that and kind of imperil the whole industry, but provide a new world of challenges, and data can help us solve that. I look at it from an angle of there are two fundamental gaps that we need to fill as we're telling stories to our readers, our viewers, our constituents, and that's a truth gap and a trust gap. And I'm interested to hear from your perspectives how data journalism and how visualization, really telling deeply immersive stories through the data, can help close and address those gaps. Troy, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So one of the kind of original names for data journalism, going back to a book, 1973, kind of one of the fathers of data journalism, Philip Meyer, wrote a book called Precision Journalism. And I thought that was a really interesting way of describing what we're trying to do. Like, what we bring with data journalism is an effort to use tools and techniques from other disciplines, from statistics or from design or from web development. We try to bring them together to tell the most precise story possible. And so you talk about the issue of this trust gap. And I think if there's a potential, at least, that data journalism and the transparency that can come along with it, as we try to tell the most precise stories we can, and we try to be as honest as we can about our methods, our methodology, our sources of data, and we make that available to our readers, there's an opportunity there for people to come together and at least argue about the same things, right? So at least have something in common that we're looking at and saying, okay, this is how you reach these conclusions. I may not agree with your conclusions, but I understand how you got there. And I think that is a step toward transparency, which is a step toward greater trust.
Got it. I like that angle. I like the perspective of not just the, hey, here's data, but here are the steps that were taken to uncover that data. Here's how we mine the data. Here's how we present the data. I love that concept, the idea of there's a common text that we can then read from and then have a meaningful, intelligent debate. Ronnie, your thoughts?
I like to think of data journalism sort of the antidote to fake news, but also as completely opposite a thing as anonymous sources, which I think a lot of people distrust these days. And not that there's anything particularly wrong with that, but data journalism, it's this is our source. This is where we're getting it from. This is a source I spent 2 hours on the phone with trying to figure out exactly how they collect their data. And you arrive at this sort of radical transparency where when you put all the cards on the table, you say, this is the data we have, this is how they got it, this is what might be wrong with it, this is what might be right with it, this is how it compares to other data sets. So then we're at least introducing this real, total clear conversation to people so that we can argue over the same set of facts. At least we have a good baseline established.
Yeah, I think it's a really important distinction, the idea between intelligent debate and discussion and arguing, right? How many of you have ever been out there on the internet? You guys heard of the internet? Yeah, there's a lot of arguing that happens out there, but there's kind of this dearth of intelligent debate. Because the idea of the data set and where that starts and how we create that data set, I think it's kind of the core of this, right? How do we construct and create a data set that is meaningful and gives us that common text, that canonical thing that we can start discussing about. How do you approach that from an analytic, from an engineering perspective?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. when we think about data, it's everywhere, right? All of our phones right now are telling all of our social media, right, where we are, right? It's producing data. When you look at the earthquakes that happened in the San Francisco Bay Area a little while ago, Fitbit did a roll-up of all of the Fitbits that woke up, and you could see where those actual shockwaves were waking people up over the course of that morning, right? And those kinds of things are producing data. So that data is there. The only question is, like, how do you actually go get it? Who can go get it? I think one of the big things in data journalism today is this sort of like the emancipation of data, the ability for every journalist, every person, and in fact, you know, when you think about enterprises or startups, every single person to be able to go access that data through open data movements, and then correlate that data using tools that allow you to easily mash up that data to create and find that story. And the second piece of it is not just like how do you tell that story, you also, how do you make that story compelling to the audience? I think this is kind of really what, you know, kind of the Associated Press and what Recode with Rani have been doing is taking that data, the big, huge sets of data, and making it very personal and understandable by the audience. And all those elements are really about how you take that data set and transform it from story discovery all the way out to story presentation.
Absolutely. And I want to come back to the depth of data and the depth of storytelling in a second, but you touched on something when you said this emancipation of the data. On the flip side, I'm curious to hear perspectives on the democratization of the accessibility of that data, as in like the core skill set and the tools that are necessary for not necessarily just the professionals who are in this room to harness that data and tell great stories with it, but Troy, to your point about readers having a common set of data that they can then dig into and have an intelligent discussion, the need for tools and for training, even at a cursory level, so people know what to do with it so they can have that intelligent debate.
I think one of the interesting things that's happening as we talk about how much data there is that it's an interesting problem to have too much data. And I was just in a meeting with some information managers from corporations, and they were being faced with this problem. They had all of this data at their disposal, but how do you make sense of it? And that's sort of what data journalism provides for the readers, is how to find a path through the data. You know, it's easy to we see a lot of data being made accessible, a lot of government data going up, and just sort of plastered about. But without some tools to make sense of that, without some tools to find a thread through it, to understand, you know, what are the outliers here, what are the anomalies, what are the trends, then it's, you know, it's just more noise. So the tools that we're looking at, the tools that we're trying to develop, and the tools that we're trying to train journalists on are about how do we find that signal in that noise. And that's a challenging thing. With greater volumes of data, that becomes a new set of problems. If you had a simple spreadsheet, finding a trend in that is as simple as, you know, sort and filter. Right? But with a larger set of data, breaking that down into chunks and finding other ways through it through visualization, I think it's one of the best tools for that, to help find the stories there that you didn't even know were there.
And I think when you start off with a very large data set, there are thousands of stories that could be told, and our job as data reporters is to sort of guide you through the story that we think is most true, that we think is most compelling. Often, I take issue with very large database sort of journalism, and it's amazing, and it's a lot of work, and like people have done incredible things with it, but often they don't engage with it for very long, and it's this very big, important thing you've made and spent months on, and you know, if someone clicks on it twice, I think the best sort of data journalism guides people through it. I always think of the best data journalism as like a reduced fraction. You know, you want to reduce it to be as simple as possible without ruining the integrity of the graphic. So I think it's our job to sort of guide people through that, and then provide, if you do want to look more deeply into it, you provide how to walk back. Okay, this is the source, this is how we did it, but I don't think it's reasonable to think that the average person is going to go and look at a database and be able to figure it out.
Sure, and that's a great point, right? It's like understanding the mathematics of databases and how that works. It's a very specialized skill set. You know, and Lukasz, to come back to your point, I'd love to dig a little deeper into your perspective on that, is this idea of the personalized data story and how we use personalization and how we use the tools to represent the data and the story in a way that really resonates with the individual reader, creates that native experience that connects them to the story. So I'd love your perspective on it, and then to talk a little bit about some of the examples that we've seen either recently or historically that really make that connection stick.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a thing about the narrative, right? Every story is a narrative. It has a beginning, a middle, and end. It has some kind of a climax. You transform as you go through that. And that's the best journalism. You see stories that describe, and you really connect, and you say, hey, that's important to me. We did a story with the Associated Press a little while ago about water quality standards, right? There was a move to increase the water quality standards led by the governor of Michigan, right? Well, they had some water quality issues in Michigan a little while ago. But that story at a national level showed the impact to all of the different states of those standards from the viewpoint of how many schools would be affected and being shown as not adhering to those standards, and what impact that could have on all of the different governors. And it allowed people to actually go and look for their own school. Where are my children actually going to school? And what is the water quality? Are they safe when they go to the water fountain? And that kind of thing of talking about a national story that has a national context with huge sums of money tied to fixing infrastructure across all the schools, tying back to the very personal level. And so this art of data journalism is about telling that national story, the thing you should be aware of, but also making it relevant to individuals. I think one of the things is, in the social media age, right, we do swipe past things, right? We see the shock and awe of our feeds, and we continue on with our days. But every now and again, one person will go and take a deeper look. And that one person works at some NGO, works in some PTA, works somewhere, and uses that to start a kind of conversation at the community level. And that's also part of the data journalism, is empowering through data. Again, we're coming back to that truth element of it, is empowering that data to be the voice, the commonality, that then transforms from an abstract thing to a very personal and relevant thing.
Yeah, and Troy and Rani, I'm interested to see how when you approach this from a narrative architecture level, how you use that data to enhance the story and drive that level of personalization. I think the role of a great storyteller, the role of our press, the role of our content creators is really to merge that human creativity and curiosity and then harness that massive computational power to tell these great stories. So I'm curious about how you approach that and great examples that you've seen.
I think one of the things that it's important for us to keep in mind is that frequently each row in a data set, each data point, the data that we work with represents a human being. And there's a human story behind that. And having that focus in mind from the beginning, I think, helps with sort of the ethics of how we approach these questions, but also with how we make it more relevant. I mean, the one topic that every reader wants to know about is me, themselves. And so how do we tell a national story?
I thought you meant you specifically.
Well, I'm inherently interesting, but yeah beyond me, they're more interesting than I am. But they want to know how they fit into this bigger story. They're seeing all these narratives happening in the news, and the national narratives may be interesting, but it's almost voyeuristic, right? Unless you engage them. So we did a partnership with Reveal, and we looked at redlining, so unfair lending practices on mortgages, something that hadn't been looked at in a while. And so there's this big story about, look, around the country, lenders are treating people of color differently than they're treating white people. Like they're more likely to be rejected. They're looking at the data and they're finding this trend. And that's an important story. But what we were able to do is drill it down to the neighborhood level. So you're able to see, is this happening in my neighborhood? And then what we saw from that is it becomes actionable. So it becomes personal and personalized. And then we have court cases, and we have the city of Philadelphia coming out and having hearings about this. And so it becomes really impactful at the point at which it becomes personal. So that's what we're trying for. We tell the narrative, the larger narrative, but try to figure out how, this is one thing that good visualization can do, helps you figure out how you fit into this larger narrative.
I agree, but I also think that, what do I think? That there are sort of stories that you could tell as long as you're making it humane. So it doesn't necessarily have to drill into, like, this is how it fits me. I think if you do understand the humanity behind a story, I wanted to bring up this New York Times graphic that I just found really stunning. It was about, they took a study of 10,000 rich black boys and 10,000 rich white boys and tracked them over the course of their life, and it saw where they ended up on the socioeconomic ladder. And all of these kids had begun rich, and you just see the blue dots, which are representing the black children, move to the bottom to be poor as adults. And in this sort of simple and elegant graphic, you learn that this whole idea of classism being more important than racism or being the same thing as racism isn't true, that there is something inherently like different about racism and how it's affecting things. So I think just infusing it with that bit of humanity makes a larger story everyone's story.
Yeah, I agree. And that's where that creativity and the hard data really like comes together. I mean, there was something so visceral about watching those blue dots fall.
Yeah.
Right? That a bar chart or a line graph or whatever just couldn't possibly convey the motion of them tumbling down hit you and made you want to read and get depth. And Lukasz, I'm curious as we start to get to the close, the yellow light just turned on, so I'm going to start talking faster. How we bring together the idea of the data science and the idea of the creativity to actually light that up through the dashboards or through the actual graphics that are created.
Yeah, I think it's, first off, data literacy is a thing. If you're not data literate, you don't know the common rhetorical techniques people use to misrepresent data, you have to learn. And the way that you learn is by using data and using tools that are readily available. Like I work on the Power BI team over at Microsoft. We make one of these tools. There's many out there that you choose your favorite one and start working with that data. And then when you work with that data, you'll see that, hey, representing a huge data set in a simple to digest way is actually kind of hard. There's an art to it. There's different visualizations you can use to represent that better or worse, or to tell a particular story. One of my favorite visualizations actually was something that Rani created, which is a network diagram. It's a chord diagram, which shows the interconnectedness between Silicon Valley companies, tech companies, and car manufacturers in the self-driving space. You would never be able to write that web of interactions in an article, ever. But you look at it once, you see it right away, and you know what that means. So playing with it, working with it, and that's the way that you get it. And then hopefully you spread the message, you teach others how to actually go and do the same thing, because it's a vital, essential skill, whether you're a startup, whether you're an established business, or whether you're in the media industry these days.
So as we're rapidly running out of time, but I want to make sure that all of our panelists have an option for 30 seconds for key takeaway on the importance of data journalism and why this is something that really everybody in this room should be investing in.
I would say that it's a very simple way to make sure that your audience understands what's going on. I don't think that people necessarily read a 600-word article, but if you show two lines crossing and put two things together that they might have not thought of putting together before, and it makes a salient, convincing point, you're doing your job, you're transferring this information as simply as possible, and I just think that it's just incredibly important. It's an incredibly important way to transmit information these days.
I think it's important on the one hand to hold the government accountable, right? For accountability. So if a government agency comes to me with a nice, pretty report with a nice, pretty pie chart in it and says, "This is all you need to know. Don't worry your pretty little head about what's behind it," I want to know what the data is behind it. I want to hold them accountable, and it has that power, and it puts the power in the hands of the journalists and in the readers. And for everyone in this room, what I've heard a lot since I've been around the conference is a lot of storytelling. Everyone is telling the story of their startup, of their company, to their customers, to their founders, to their funders, telling that story with data and putting context around that data so that your data is not lying to you, so that you're telling your story as accurately, as precisely as possible. There's value in that. And
so I actually completely agree with you. One of the things that I've seen is the trend is clear. Data journalists are the people that teach businesses how to use data effectively. So when you're talking about your next board presentation, your next funder presentation, how to understand that data and learn how to present that data, analyze it. You can look at journalism and see thousands of examples being created every single day. If you look at Tufte, a few, if you look at Donna Wong, if you look at Alberto Cairo, these are either people who were journalists and now write about data visualization, or they were looking at what journalists were creating and saying, actually, you should do it a little bit better. Those people are teaching us how to use data effectively in common conversation in our everyday lives, and it's really important for us to pay attention and learn, get inspired, and then repeat.
Excellent. Guys, our time is up. They just put up the next presentation here on the conference monitor. That's our cue to leave. Thank you for hanging out with us. If you have questions, if you want to learn more about how we can help you tell great data stories, myself and the panelists will be hanging out outside. We'd love to talk to you.
Awesome. Well done.